This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Republican debate craziness should help the Democrats, says Brookings scholar Elaine Kamarck. FDR scholar Richard Moe compares the plight of Syrian refugees with that of Jews denied entry into the United States in the 1930s. And Bill Press talks with Morris Pearl, a businessman who wants the rich to pay more in taxes. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Public affairs scholar Elaine Kamarck thinks the wackiness of the entire Republican presidential field can only help the Democratic nominee. And we say hello to Elaine Kamarck, who's the founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management and a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. She is a public sector scholar with wide experience in government, academia, and politics, and the author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates. Elaine Kamarck, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for having me.
Always nice to speak with you. You have a long and distinguished background in Democratic politics. Most of the attention lately has been on the Republican presidential race. Is that a good thing for Democrats?
It's a little bit worrisome just because, I mean, let's face it, the Republicans are in the middle of a civil war in their party. There's a lot of candidates. There are colorful candidates and that are, interesting to watch. And so it's understandable that they're getting the lion's share of attention. The worry I have for the Democrats is that the Democratic message just isn't, it's kind of lost in all this. I mean, all the talk is who can be more awful on immigration, right? Who can be more of a climate denier? I mean, that's been the conversation. Now, we're about to go from the preseason to the real game, okay? And that's kind of the way in my book, I look at the nomination system. This pre-primary season, a lot of weird stuff happens. When you get into the real season, things tend to settle down a little bit more. So the Republican race may shake out. The Democratic race, I think, may get a little bit more attention as we go into the season. But, you always kind of, on the one hand, you hope for party unity. On the other hand, you hope for attention. Unfortunately, in our world, only fighting seems to get attention. And so the Democrats are a little bit disadvantaged in that respect.
It's funny because I was thinking about this recently with all of the Republicans that are in the race, and not that many have dropped out. Now, granted, we still have a ways to go, but this would be a rare time when this might actually be an advantage for Republicans to have this many people in it because they're all talking wacky stuff. And it really does seem to be taking all the attention away from Democrats.
Yeah, it is. Now, the question is, what happens when the races get to next summer and we've got two nominees? I like to quote a Republican, actually, operative who was in the Romney campaign, who said, politics is like high school. You are who you hang out with. And the reason I like that quote so much is that the wackier the Republicans are, even if they ended up nominating a sort of sensible Republican type like John Kasich, I'm glad for the Dems and afraid for the Republicans. What will happen is that the Republicans, that whoever they nominate will be kind of painted with the craziness of the other people in the field. That, frankly, is good for the Democrats. And I think it happened to Romney 4 years ago. He had those nutty Senate candidates who kept saying things like women who were raped couldn't get pregnant, etc. And even though he disavowed them, he never did it strongly enough to be able to break the connection between him and other people in his party. And I think that the advantage the Democrats have this time is that so much sort of offensive conversation has gone on in this Republican primary that by the time we get to September and you have a Republican candidate trying to talk to a broader audience, I'm not sure that he will be able to.
You know, talking about wacky stuff, today's economic conditions find many Republicans and Tea Party voters sounding like Bernie Sanders. And many Hillary Clinton supporters, they work on Wall Street. So are things getting a little upside down overall in this in the race?
Well, there's a lot of pent-up anger at Wall Street, which is why I think, people are attacking Hillary Clinton for that, even though, there's not anything she's done that says to me that she's a tool of Wall Street other than, representing New York for a while in the Senate. But, she didn't really do anything like that. I think that what's going on out there, though, is there's a lot of pent-up anger at Wall Street, and the Obama administration didn't prosecute them as aggressively as I think they could have. They really didn't go after some of the culprits strongly enough, and I think a lot of people are mad at that. And you've got anger on the left and anger on the right. And you've got people very distrustful of the big banks. And so I think that that's what you're seeing both in the Republicans and in the Democrats, and that's why some of the Tea Partiers sound like some of the Bernie Sanders supporters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't say that I don't disagree with that. I felt like there were a lot of people that probably should have been jailed after that crisis, and basically, they've still got offices and they're still making a lot of money. And that's that's never set well
true.
with me.
Yeah, and frankly, there really were things that could have been done when the outrage was high. And maybe you couldn't have jailed people because they were basically manipulating a system that was a perfectly legal and flawed system.
Sure.
But so maybe you couldn't have sent them to jail, but boy, you could have limited pay, or, you could have put caps on their pay. You could have done things to change the massive amounts of money they make, and the short-term view that they have of the business world.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Elaine Kamarck, founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management and senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution, also the author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates, available at Amazon. Elaine, what are the reasons for stagnant or declining incomes and slow growth of the economy? Is it globalization, technology, all of the above?
Well, it is globalization, it is technology, and those are forces that you really can't do much about. I do think, however, there are things that we can do something about. And the first one is the one that I think has been the biggest disappointment to Democrats, is that we have not been able in the last 8 years to get the government together to engage in a robust infrastructure rebuilding program. Are the Democratic allies in the labor movement are all for this? There's nothing could have been better for the industrial labor unions than to have a lot of infrastructure spending. Nothing could be better for the long-term growth of the economy than that. And so that, I think, has been a major missed opportunity of the last 8 years, and we need to put that front and center for the next 8 years. So that is something that can be done. I think the other thing that can be done is I think we can pass a variety of regulations in the under the Securities Exchange Commission to alter the incentives for short-term behavior on the part of corporate America. one of the things that has been most disturbing in the last decade is the lack of investment corporations have made in their labor force and the degree to which they've engaged in stock buybacks and other behaviors that are really geared towards making their executives and their stockholders really, really wealthy. There's got to be a better balance between getting investors a return on investment and investing in your labor force and investing in growth. And we've let that get way out of line. I think Hillary Clinton, actually, in her June economic speech, began to look at some serious things that could be done to fix that. So I think if we looked at fixing short-termism in corporate America, and we looked at infrastructure, those are two things that we can do about declining wages and incomes in the economy.
How do we get wages to go up without a labor movement, which seems to all be dead right now?
Well, one thing we get them to do is we get companies to invest in labor, invest in their employees, and that hasn't happening. In fact, that's why you see so many people being employed in sort of the temporary workforce, in short-term contracts and things like that, is that nobody wants to invest in labor anymore. So labor, not labor unions, but labor. And I also think there are some things we can do to strengthen labor unions and strengthen the formation of unions. I think we are long overdue for labor law reform in this country, and that there are a lot of industries that would in fact benefit from a labor movement. But I also think the labor movement has been slow to look at the new world. The labor movement needs to be really relevant in the future, needs to be the place where people go to find really qualified employees and really well-trained employees. The one piece of the economy that seems to have gotten that right are the electricians. You know, everybody wants a union electrician to work on their house, because guess what? If you don't, your house might burn down. Mm-hmm. And so and one of the things the electricians have done historically is that they've just been doing constant training. So you know that if somebody's a member of the electricians union, they might be a little bit more expensive, but boy, oh boy, you're going to get something that's safe. That kind of mentality, I think, needs to take over the entire union movement. And it hasn't, frankly. It's been really slow. It really hasn't taken over the union movement. And I think it needs to make unions a more relevant part of the modern economy.
Trade jobs, electricians, carpenters, specialty things like that. I know a few people in the building industry, and one of their complaints is that they can't find high qualified tradesmen because they're not being taught to be tradesmen anymore. This probably would be a deterioration of one of the outcomes is a deterioration of the unions. If you could make it more appealing, this seems like if you get the trade back up on their feet and get people trained that way, that would help build up the unions again.
Absolutely, and it's a little bit circular, you know what I mean?
Right.
If the unions could become the best source of high quality workers, then people would want to be part of the union because they would want to get that training, right? So it's a little bit chicken and egg. You got to be doing both things need to be happening.
Yeah.
And it really hasn't been happening to the extent that it needs to happen. I think there's a second issue that nobody wants to talk about either. But I know that one of the senators talked to me about this he's from a rural state, Democrat, but from a rural state. And he said, look, the other problem is, frankly, there's just a lot of addiction out there among people who used to be in these working class jobs. Just a lot of alcoholism, a lot of meth, a lot of, drug addiction, and people. So why do they hire people who come here illegally from Bolivia, right? Because they're not on drugs. And so I think we've got a real, I mean, especially in kind of rural America and in blue-collar America, we have got to address addiction problems.
Are we experiencing the end of the middle class as we knew it?
We are certainly experiencing the erosion of the middle class. That is for sure. A little bit of that, I think, is inevitable because we are making a transition from an industrial economy to an information economy. But I don't think as much of that is inevitable as some people would argue. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to save the middle class and bulk up the middle class.
What about the Democratic Party itself? Where is it going as a standard bearer for working Americans, you think?
I think it's on the right track, but the Democrats always fall. The problem they have is they always fall back into an era that doesn't exist anymore. I'm from Massachusetts. I vote in Massachusetts. And I remember not too long a governor's race where the Democratic gubernatorial candidate lost to a Republican, which in one of the bluest states in the country actually happens with some regularity. One of the reasons it happened is that as this candidate went around, the candidate sounded as if it was 1932. You know, It was like music to Democratic ears. It sounded great to Democratic ears, but that world just doesn't exist anymore. And most of the new voters in Massachusetts are in that high-tech corridor of Route 128, et cetera. So with some regularity in a very Democratic state, a Republican wins the governorship. Mostly because of the fact that when the Democrats talk about the economy, they're not talking about an economy that people are familiar with anymore. And so I think that the Democrats, you know, as usual, their heart is in the right place, but they've got to modernize that message, whether it's labor unions and what they do or, you know, any other part of the message. They've got to make it sound like the world that we are living in, not like the world in 1932 when Roosevelt got elected.
Mm-hmm. So a chicken in every pot is probably not a good theme for a campaign.
Yeah, I think a chicken in every pot just doesn't cut it anymore.
Okay. Elaine Kamarck, founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management and senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Also, the author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates, available at Amazon. Elaine, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Oh, please do, and thanks very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Richard Moe has written about FDR and takes the lesson from the 1930s that we should admit Syrian refugees, and we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Here's a twist on Christmas that would make Jesus weep. First, a right-wing faction in the U.S. has been wringing its hands over a hokey cultural crisis cooked up by the faction itself, namely that liberals, atheists, humanists, and, God forbid, Marxists are waging a war on Christmas. The infidels are not accused of lobbing bombs in this war, but words of mass destruction. Specifically, the right-wing purists wail that unholy lefties are perverting the season by saying Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. Second, some ultra-conservative members of this same faction have launched their own war against Jesus. How twisted is this? They say no one should mess with the word Christmas, yet they're messing with the guy Christmas is supposed to be about. Okay, technically they're not going directly at Jesus, but at a key part of his message, and in particular at a key messenger of Christianity, Pope Francis. They've decided that the Pope is a Marxist, pointing out that Francis speaks often about the, quote, structural causes of poverty, the idolatry of money, and the new tyranny of unfettered capitalism. Obviously, say the Pontiff's pious critics, that's commie talk. The clincher for them was when Francis wrote an official papal document in which he asked in outrage, how can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? See, cried the carpers, that's proof that Francis is the Red Pope. But wait, that was a very good question he asked, one ripe with the moral wrath that Jesus himself frequently showed toward the callous rich in their love of money. Indeed, the Pope's words ring with deep ethics you find in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Was he a commie too? This is Jim Hightower saying, could it be that the carpers are actually the ones lacking in real Christmas spirit?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. A scholar who has studied Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration says FDR could have done more to save European Jews, and that America should now take in Syrian refugees. And we say hello to Richard Moe, who served as Chief of Staff to Vice President Walter Mondale and as a Senior Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. From 1993 to 2010, he was President of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. His latest book, Roosevelt's Second Act, tells the story of how FDR decided to run for an unprecedented third term as war was breaking out in Europe. Richard Moe, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back with you.
And nice to have you with us, of course. As an expert on FDR, do you think he or a person like him could be elected today? I mean, was he an anomaly in American political history?
That's a really good question, and of course we don't know. But it breaks down in my mind into two questions. One, and this is fascinating. I think it's the least important. He was crippled, and he was confined to a wheelchair, and he could only stand with the assistance of others. Could he have been elected today with that disability known to the American people? It was only partially known back in his own time because the press would not take pictures of him in a wheelchair, and he always gave the appearance of being robust and healthy. But there are serious people who have written biographies of FDR who think that he could not be elected today because he was crippled, and that word "cripple" is the operative word here. I don't buy into that. I don't know, of course, but I think that American people are more understanding of that and would rely on their judgment as to whether or not he had the mental capabilities and the toughness and so forth to handle the presidency. I think your larger question is, could somebody who represented his approach to government be elected today? And in a sense, I think so, because he had many leadership qualities. I mean, he had the enormous ability to persuade. You know, the fireside chats that he did on radio, where people couldn't see that he was disabled, but they heard this very strong, confident voice. And at the beginning of the Depression, and then during World War II, he gave the country enormous confidence because they thought that he was coming right into their living room, speaking to them, and he provided extraordinary leadership. And he's kind of the model for presidential leadership in my mind. Whether or not you have somebody with those abilities today and elect him, look at what's going on in this election of 2016. I mean, the electorate is all over the place, at least on the Republican side. And but I think there's definitely room in this country for people with the kind of leadership skills that FDR had, because he focused on the issues that were most important to the American people, not these extraneous issues, but issues of war and peace and issues of economic disparity. And he was the first president who really saw the great disparity economically amongst the American people, and he did a lot about it through these agencies and the aid programs that he created that had a huge consequence. And some of them have carried over. Times, of course, are different, so the remedies would be somewhat different.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because obviously today's economy, we're suffering from the biggest income disparities since FDR took the White House from Herbert Hoover. Should President Obama and other Democrats going forward take a few pages from the New Deal, or is it possible that even FDR couldn't rescue the middle class today? In other words, is it that much different today than it was then that those same things couldn't be done?
Well, FDR was greatly advantaged by the fact that he had a heavily Democratic Congress, and the country was desperate for help. So when he came in the first 100 days in 1933, everything he sent to the Congress was enacted almost immediately, sometimes the same day. Just take example, one modest program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where literally millions of young unemployed Americans were put to work planting trees, building roadways, parkways, and serving public interest in communities and rural areas all over the country, and earning a modest income, most of which they were required to send home to their families. Well, whether or not something exactly like that would work today, not clear. But some kind of a work program that served public works and public interests, that taught people skills. And that was the other thing about these programs. They taught skills that served these people for a long time. It wasn't just all, manual work. But they taught people how to carve and how to build furniture and set rocks. And these were, just the concept of it. And this is FDR. He was very proud of this program. And then we came through, with Social Security and other programs like that, rural electrification. I think there are some things like that. Now, government can't. There's not a receptivity to do it for government to do everything it did back in the 30s. It has to be much more selective, and I think appropriately the private sector has to be brought in more to do what it can do best, because, as we've seen, government doesn't always do the best work.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Richard Moe, former Chief of Staff, of course, to Vice President Walter Mondale, Senior Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, and talking a little bit about his latest book, Roosevelt's Second Act. Dick, when people complain about that President Obama leads from behind, isn't that really what FDR did when he waited for the country to realize that we had to get into World War II?
There is some similarity there. What FDR realized, what I think most presidents realized, because it was President Lincoln that first articulated it, he said, with public opinion, you can do everything. Without public opinion, you can do nothing. And so FDR believed strongly that just his voice alone wasn't enough to move public opinion. So if there was some momentous decision, for example, giving up American neutrality and changing the arms embargo, things like that, or sending arms to Britain and France, there had to be an event. In that case, it was Hitler's invasion of France that rallied the country, because they didn't want to see France fall. It did fall, but he thought that he absolutely had to have public opinion with him, and he was very shrewd about that, because it would be easy to get out there just vocally make the case, but not have anybody. He did this once in 1937. He gave a speech on collective security in Chicago, and talking about the fascist powers, there was no support for it whatsoever because there was no context. And he told his speechwriter, he says, "There's nothing worse than looking behind and see that nobody's following you. You know, you make a speech like that." And so he was very wary. He was determined to act when he made up his mind. He had to act, but he looked for the best moment, and he tried to wait and even precipitate an event that would make the public more receptive to going in the direction that he wanted to go.
Now, after Roosevelt, Republicans changed the Constitution to limit presidential terms. Was that a good idea? I mean, certainly post-Reagan Republicans didn't think it was so hot.
Well, I think they're divided on that because, as we know, President Reagan was beginning to suffer from Alzheimer's, I think, at the end of his second term. I think that's true. But in any case, the Republicans couldn't wait to change the Constitution. And I think the country was ready, too, because even FDR recognized that people were getting tired of him towards the end. Even through the end of his second term, he recognized that. He would not have been elected to his third term in 1940 if it hadn't been for the war. Because people did feel that 2 terms were enough. Washington and Jefferson set this precedent. Every president, since had abided by it. A couple tried and failed. Ulysses Grant and Teddy Roosevelt failed. So his was the first effort to break this tradition, and he did it only because of the war. People saw the threat of the war, and he was a trusted leader, and they didn't want to change horses in midstream. So. So the Republicans deeply resented this and didn't want it to happen again. Never foresaw a situation like Reagan coming down the pike. But I think it's been fine for the country, and I don't sense any groundswell for changing that. If we ever got into another situation like that, then FDR really seriously looked for alternatives to run. He needed somebody to run who supported his foreign and domestic policies and who could win the election in 1940. In the end, he couldn't find anybody. So he said, I have to do it. So they conjured up this thinly veiled draft scenario at the convention, and he did run, and he ran successfully, although towards the end, they thought that he thought he might well lose. So. It's a complicated issue, but I think on the whole, the country is served by a 2-term limitation, and as I say, I don't sense any real sentiment to change it.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we let you go, obviously, there's been a lot of talk lately, given the refugee crisis that we're seeing, and that under FDR, Jewish refugees were barred on grounds that Nazi saboteurs might sneak into the country with them. Number one, is that absolutely true in your opinion? And number two, should that situation inform current policy toward refugees?
Well, I'm not an authority on that aspect of World War II. FDR actually did admit refugees, and more than any other country at that time. Could he have done more? Yes, he could have done more. But unfortunately, there was rampant anti-Semitism in the country, and there was some fear of saboteurs. And I don't know the degree to which they were screened, but I don't think there were many examples of actual sabotage. In any case, I think we owe it to ourselves and our tradition, as well as to the rest of the world, to take a significant number of Syrian refugees. And what we have shown over recent years is that we know how to do this. It takes time, but we know how to screen them, and we know how to ferret out those who are risks to our security. And obviously, nobody wants to admit people who are serious risks to our security.
All right.
So I think we should go ahead and accept more refugees, to the extent we can handle them, but make sure they're very carefully screened.
Okay. Richard Moe, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Walter Mondale, Senior Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. His latest book, Roosevelt's Second Act. Dick, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Morris Pearl, the head of Patriotic Millionaires.
So something very unusual happened at the Capitol the other day. Usually the Capitol, the halls of the Capitol are filled with people coming in saying, "Don't raise my taxes. I don't want to pay any more taxes. I don't want to pay any taxes at all." This is an unusual group of people who came to the Capitol to say, we want to pay our fair share of taxes, and we're proud to pay our fair share of taxes. And many of us in our category are not paying our fair share of taxes, and we are all millionaires. It's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires. Morris Pearl, who's the head of that organization, joins us on our news line this morning. Hello, Morris. Good to have you with us.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Press. Thank you.
It's Bill, please. And so tell us about your visit on the Hill. I imagine these senators and members of Congress are surprised to see somebody coming in and saying, actually, we want to pay more taxes, or we don't think we're paying enough.
Well, it shouldn't be surprising, because the gross inequality that's increasing in our nation is really bad for everybody. It's bad for poor people, but it's also bad for rich people. Business people can't run businesses in a country that has like a small oligarchy of rich people and lots of poor people. So we need a robust middle class where everybody can make money and everybody can participate in both politics and the economic life of our nation. So I don't think it should be a surprise, but yes, you're right, it is a surprise, and that's why it's newsworthy.
Did you get a good reception and did you meet with any Republicans as well as Democrats?
We met with the staff people of several Republican senators. We didn't actually see any actual Republican senators. But yeah, and the staff people, it's always, from the Republican side, it's always, well, yes, big part of comprehensive tax reform. And that's what they mean. Well, we'll remove a few loopholes, like this carried interest loophole we were talking about, if we can lower taxes in general. And we just try to explain to them that we don't think taxes need to be lowered. Our nation is the most powerful nation in the world, not because we have less government, but because we have a government that does things for people.
Is there any particular legislation that you're supporting, or is it just in general the concept that we have to do something about income inequality and make those who can afford to pay their fair share?
The group was created, Bill, to urge the president to let the Bush tax cuts expire just for the wealthiest. As you know, we compromised in 2010. In 2012, that actually happened, became the law of the land. Since then, we've sort of expanded our remit to inequality more generally. Specifically, we're looking at this loophole that people who earn carried interest, primarily hedge fund managers, private equity managers, and similar asset managers, get to pay taxes on part of their normal income at capital gains rates, which are much lower than the regular rates that people like you who work for a living pay. So there is a specific piece of legislation that Tammy Baldwin and Sandra Levin and the Senate and House respectively are sponsoring to address that. Just ridiculous inequality. That's the one that even Donald Trump has been talking about being unfair.
Right. And that particularly applies to hedge fund managers, doesn't it?
Well, it applies to people who manage other people's money. Basically, if you invest money in a long-term, in something for the long term, you pay a lower tax rate. But people who just advise people to invest their money can sometimes also take advantage of that tax rate. So it's basically people in the asset management industry, hedge fund managers, private equity managers, and other similar things.
Now, yesterday on this topic, Hillary Clinton met with Warren Buffett, picked up his endorsement, and she talked about this issue. Here's Secretary Clinton yesterday.
I'm going to fight hard to try to implement what is called the Buffett rule. The Buffett rule says that millionaires should pay at least 30% income tax rates instead of 10, 15, 20, and I want to go even further.
Is she right, Morris?
Yes. Yeah, I think she's right because, and Warren Buffett has been in New York meeting with donors, prospective donors for the Clinton campaign also. So, yeah, I support, I agree with that. That what she's getting at is the fact that millionaires earn their income from sitting at home and just watching their stock appreciate in their portfolio, and they pay a lower tax rate than people who actually work for a living. And we think that it's inequitable. It's not fair. And, we don't think that's right.
In the perfect world, or maybe not the perfect world, but what do you think should be the top rate for those who make, for millionaires, those in that top 1 or 2%?
Well, I mean, our group isn't advocating for a specific top rate. We think that millionaires, people who make a lot of money, should pay more tax than people who make little money. The economy was extremely successful in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when tax rates were much higher than they are now.
Yeah.
The tax rates in our country had been higher than 70% for much of our history, during which time we had huge expansions. So I'm not saying we need that today, but I'm saying we need equity. I think what people are complaining about is the unfairness of the tax rate. Mm-hmm. The fact that people who make a lot of money pay tax at a lower rate than people who make less money. So we think it's the gross unfairness and inequity in the system that's really making people just lose confidence that we have a fair system here in our country.
And I think we've also had enough years of waiting for the trickle down, right?
It doesn't trickle down.
Exactly.
That's not the right answer. People make money when lots of people in the economy have money to spend on things. Some of our members are Ben Cohen, who started Ben & Jerry's. He says, I need people who make enough money to be able to afford to buy premium ice cream. And that's what business people need, is lots of consumers who can afford to buy expensive stuff.
Yeah, you're putting the stuff out there if people can't afford to buy it, right? Ben Cohen, by the way, Ben Cohen, one of the greatest people I've ever met. He's been a guest here in studio with us. Talk about a success story and a wonderful guy.
Yes, I agree.
On so many different levels. How many of you are there, Patriotic Millionaires? I just love the whole concept of it. And you come from all around the country?
Yeah, there's a couple hundred people that are actually paying members of our organization. Mm-hmm. We come a lot from the East Coast and the West Coast, and a small number from the states in the middle.
I'd love to attend one of those meetings.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, I know. Keith, I know. I saw on the list Keith Mestrich is a good friend too from Amalgamated Bank. Has been our guest here in studio.
Yeah, he lives right just outside of Washington D.C. He's one of our members and helps lead our organization. In fact,
right. Well, it's good. And people want to find out more. You can always go to patrioticmillionaires.org. And it's just nice to know for those of us out there struggling month to month that there are some people who are doing very well who are thinking about us and saying the tax structure, the tax code has to be fair so that everybody does pay their fair share and all of the money is not going to those few at the very top. Morris Pearl, thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for your time with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
All right, Morris Pearl. He's the head of Patriotic Millionaires. Don't you love it?
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Love that message.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Elaine Kamarck, Richard Moe, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy.